All right, we are continuing to talk about laws of nature. We talked about Hume, right, and his skepticism about sort of necessary connection, what that concept could even mean, which seems to be something that people want, a concept people want to use when they're describing laws of nature. Drop something, it will necessarily fall to the ground. And Hume just couldn't figure out where we get this idea of necessary connection from. Um, then we had Swartz, who sort of developed that into a full-fledged theory of laws of nature, right? And his on regularity theory, we called it. On this account, a law of nature is just a true description, basically, of things that happen. There are a few more conditions, right? It had to be sort of universal, not just local. Um, Laws are just descriptions. There's no extra metaphysical oomph, right? So the law of gravity isn't pushing things around or pulling them. It's just describing how things behave. Then we saw Armstrong, who had some objections to regularity theory. And now we're going to see Dretske, who's going to have a few more. I think Dretske, he has some ways that sort of cut to the heart of it, I think, in a different way than Armstrong discussed. And then Dretke's going to offer another account, which is a necessitarian account, right? It does invoke this idea of necessity in laws of nature. Okay, so before Dretske sort of attacks regularity theory, he wants to, convince you it's worth arguing against. So he sort of summarizes the motivation, the reason you might want to believe regularity theory. And he formulates it as something like this, right? So we observe a lot of F's being G's. I think at this point you should be comfortable with that terminology. It could be swans being white, objects falling towards, accelerating towards the Earth at 9.81 meters per second squared, gases expanding when heated, right? So we have all these observations and these correlations. He says, according to the regularity theorist, right, those observations alone are just never going to provide evidence for any claim that's any stronger than F's or G's, right? Swans are white. Not going to give you or like swans are necessarily white, right? So he sort of compares, on behalf of the regularity theorist, compares this impulse to make the claim stronger to like trying to somehow prove that all bachelors are unmarried by just sort of surveying bachelors. Right? Just walk up to bachelors and say, "Are you married or not?" And they say no. You say, "Aha, more proof that bachelors are necessarily unmarried." I mean, that is true, right? It's an analytic statement, so it's going to be necessarily true, but you don't prove that it's necessary by just giving examples. It's just the wrong kind of evidence for that sort of like modal claim, we call it. And since observation is the only sort of evidence we have for laws of nature, it follows that the strongest claim we can ever make about laws of nature is just the fact that, yeah, all swans are white, right? All objects happen to accelerate uh, at this value. So a law, again, for the regularity theorist, just a description of what is. But Dretske wants to sort of poke at this problem, and he wants to give some examples that show that our concept of law, what we're thinking about when we talk about a law of nature, actually is going to have to be stronger than what the regularity theorist claims it is. And we've seen this sort of method a few times in the course, a very common method in philosophy, where you take someone's account, right, either a regularity theorist or the deductive nomological account of explanation, and you come up with an example that meets all their criteria for what should be a law of nature or a good explanation or whatever. And we show that actually it can spit out really bad examples, stuff that sort of intuitively we think that should not count as a law, that should not count as an explanation. Dretke's going to do the same sort of thing. And here, one way that he points this out is he shows that laws are opaque, right? They have opacity in a way that sort of just the universal generalizations of the regularity theorists does not have. So what do we mean by opacity? What he means is that coextensive predicates are interchangeable, right, in universal statements, but they aren't interchangeable in laws. And that means that laws are opaque, right, whereas universal statements are transparent. So what the heck is a coextensive predicate? So predicates are just sort of words, descriptors, right? So is green, right? Is a diamond, lives in San Diego, right? These are descriptions that we can apply to objects, properties that objects have. That's what a predicate is. And sometimes they're coextensive, which means they pick out the same set of objects. So if I were to say all creatures with a heart and all creatures with a kidney, right? So these are two separate predicates, definitely even different concepts, right? And yet it just so happens that all the things out there that have a heart also have a kidney. So they're coextensive, right? Pick out the same set of objects. Um, and in a universal statement, that would be totally interchangeable. So if I say all creatures with a heart breathe oxygen, uh, I could substitute in all creatures with a kidney breathe oxygen, would still come out true, right? Would still be a perfectly good generalization. Um, but in the case of laws, he wants to say that if you do that sort of switching out of coextensive predicates, you can lose sort of the law status of the statement. And his example is this. All diamonds have a refractive index of 2.419. You may recall a refractive index is just sort of the angle at which light sort of, if you send light through a diamond, it's going to sort of bend, come out at a different angle. So call this a law of nature, right? That diamonds. It just so happens that all diamonds are mined in kimberlite. So this coextensive predicate to say things mined in kimberlite, right? That will also pick out all the diamonds. But Dretske points out if we swap those terms out, swap out those predicates, if we say all things mined in kimberlite have a refractive index of 2.419, that should intuitively strike us as not being a law of nature, right? That's sort of an accidental thing. The reason that diamonds have the refractive index they do, presumably, is because of their molecular structure, right? But being mined in kimberlite, and I don't know a ton of geology, but let's say that that's not, that doesn't affect the molecular structure, right? That's just sort of, it's just sometimes it's an accidental that, right, the same set of objects have two of the same properties. There's no lawful connection there between where something is mined and its refractive index, where there should be. Intuitively, there is a lawful connection between the substance that it is, the sort of molecular structure it has, and its refractive index. So this is the opacity, right? You can't just switch out coextensive terms like this. It stops being a law if you do. Okay, so again, this is opacity. And if you can make the substitution, then we'll call it transparent. Now, if you're a philosophy major, you may have encountered a different kind of opacity. So we'll briefly sort of talk about that so we don't get too confused. When we talk about things like people's beliefs, there's another kind of opacity. So, for example, if I said, Lois believes Superman saved the day, right? Well, if she doesn't know that Superman is Clark Kent, then it might actually be false to say that she believes Clark Kent saved the day, right? So in the case of belief, when it's filtered through somebody's belief, swapping out coextensive predicates like that can turn a true statement into a false statement. Now it's slightly different in the case of laws, right? It doesn't turn a true generalization into a false generalization, but what it does do is it turns a law into a non-law, right? By switching out these coextensive predicates. So it's a different kind of opacity, but we're still going to call it opacity. Now, regularity theorists are not without their response to this sort of objection. And Dretske sort of summarizes, he sort of lumps their general, he says, this is what they tend to say. They tend to say, okay, yeah, we note this opacity issue, right? But they want to say this is not indicative of some fundamental difference between laws and universal generalizations. Rather, it's just kind of a function of the way we tend to use laws, right? And they say if you add sort of an extra condition, right, that stipulates how we use the generalization, then you won't get this problem. So they'll add an extra condition, and different people offer different options, right? But Dretske lists five, right? It might be so a law might be a universal generalization that is highly confirmed, right? Or it might be widely accepted, have good explanatory potential. It might have deductive integration with a larger set of statements. So that means sort of like that it's there's a whole sort of set of laws and conditions that you can make derivations from. It might be its sort of usefulness for prediction. So sort of like Dretske sort of lumps these all together. He says, okay, regularity theorists, they get around this opacity problem by saying a law is a universal truth plus. And you might see how that could sort of help, right? So take explanatory potential. The fact that diamonds have this refractive index, um, right? You link that up with some laws about the molecular structure of diamonds, and we can do sort of a deep explanation of why it has the refractive index it has. If you used things mined in kimberlite instead, it's not going to be as explanatory, it's not going to be as helpful. You're not going to really understand the deep reason why it has a refractive index that it does. It might be more helpful for prediction, right? To talk about diamonds rather than just stuff mined in kimberlite. So yeah, maybe this helps, right? But Dretske's not going to buy it. Um, so here he's going to tell us necessitarianism, right? So here's the basic. We're going to come back to some objections to regularity theory. Right here, Dresky wants to sort of lay it on the line what he thinks his view is, right? So he wants to argue that this opacity comes up, right, arises not because of, like the regularity theorist says, some sort of extra fact about the way we happen to use scientific laws. He wants to say it's because laws, right, the basic concept of what a law is, that we all kind of believe in our hearts, it's not a relationship between sets of objects. Right? It's not a relationship between all the things that happen to be diamonds and all the things that happen to have a particular refractive index. Rather, it's a relationship between F-ness and G-ness, right? Diamondness, right? The property of being a diamond and the property of having a particular refractive index, right? It's these properties that have this necessary relationship. And the objects that have those properties will also have that relationship, but it's not in virtue of the objects themselves, it's in virtue of the properties. This distinction between a property sort of taken by itself and an object having a property might be slightly weird to you because you might think, well, all there is in the universe is objects. Extra thing, right? Properties on their own, the property of diamondness sort of floating free of objects. Um, and yeah, it's a little weird. We'll talk about it later, right? Tversky's going to say you just kind of have to swallow that because everything else makes sense in this view, and regularity theory is so bad that you have to get used to it. Okay, so what is this distinction again between sort of the property of diamondness and the property and just sort of the set of objects that happen to be diamonds? Well, for any object that happens to be a diamond, there's going to be a lot of predicates that you can apply to it. Right? It may have the predicate of being owned by Nate, the predicate of being kept in a box, of being set in a ring, right? But none of that is true of it sort of in virtue of its being a diamond, right? Its being a diamond doesn't sort of like entail or necessitate its being owned by Nate. But we do want to say that it has the refractive index it has in virtue of it being a diamond, right? If it has a diamond, it's guaranteed to have that refractive index, necessitated. And so there seems to be a special subset of the properties, right, that something can have a much deeper relationship or a law-like relationship, and not any true generalization is going to have that relationship, right? Maybe if we if it were the case, as the regularity theorist seems to think, that we were just talking about groups of objects, then this should be a law, right? So imagine I'm a super rich, sort of super villain. I buy up every diamond in the world and I keep them in a big box in my secret vault underground. Okay, so if you said, okay, everything in a box in Nate's secret vault, that would pick out all the diamonds, right? If I had bought them all and put them in the box. And absolutely, it shouldn't be a law of nature that everything in a box in Nate's secret vault has a refractive index of 2.419, right? Tomorrow I could put a marble in there, and all of a sudden, right, that's not going to be true. We want laws, right, to, again, it should have something to do with the fact that they're diamonds, not with some fact that accidentally picks out the same group of objects. And Gretzky wants to say, yeah, that's because the property of diamondness doesn't entail anything about being in my vault, right? So if laws are relationships among properties, then it's not going to turn out that that's a law that everything in my vault has a refractive index of 2.419. So on the necessitarian view, you don't get these bad laws, these generalizations that aren't laws. And so this is the necessitarian view, laws of relationships between properties. Later in the David Lewis paper, we're going to have to talk about some sort of more subtle differences between properties and universals. For now, we don't need to worry so much about it. Okay, so we have laws and we have universal generalizations. And Dretske says they're different, right? Against the regularity. These are two different things. Laws will entail universal generalizations, but they aren't going to be identical to them, and they're not going to be entailed by them. Right? So, if it's a law, right, that all diamonds have a refractive index 2.419, and we also have the extra sort of fact, non-law, but fact, that all diamonds are mined in kimberlite, then you will get, right, it will entail that all things mined in kimberlite have a refractive index of 2.419. That will be a true generalization, but it will not be a law. And again, I mentioned this weirdness of like, what is diamondness apart from being a diamond? Um, and we'll get back to that. But before we get back to that, Dretske knows that this, especially for people that are into metaphysics and they find it very hard to swallow any kind of like sort of like trippy, like metaphysically weird properties. He knows it's going to be problematic for some people, so he wants to prove to you how hopeless regularity theory is, and then he's going to say, just buy into the existence of diamondness. Overall, it's just the only way to go. Right? So let's look again at how hopeless regularity theory is for him. Okay, here's one problem, and we saw in Armstrong too. Laws support counterfactuals, right? And just pure universal generalizations don't. Right? Universal generalizations talk about what is the case, but they don't help us too much in talking about what could be the case, right? If things were different. So Dreske's example is maybe, for all we know, it's true that all dogs born at sea have been Cocker Spaniels, right? Suppose that's true. We shouldn't take that to entail that if I took a dachshund on the boat, right, and the dachshund had a baby, that it would give birth to a Cocker Spaniel, right? That seems false, right? But the problem is that it seems to be somehow entailed by the regularity theory, right? Another example, just because all the marbles in a bag are red, right, it doesn't imply that if this marble that I hold in my hand, if I put it in the bag, it would be red, right? So a blue marble doesn't actually become red by being added to a bag. So again, these generalizations, these just statements of what is, don't seem to help us predict or talk about what could be if things were different. Here's another way to think about the difference between generalizations and laws, and that's about how do we confirm laws, right? So suppose I have the hypothesis that everyone in this room is over 30, right? I pick out of some room. Everyone in there is over 30. Well, if that's just a description of what is, right, just a generalization, then I can confirm that by myself walking into the room, right, because I'm over 30, right? So I've just increased the probability that everyone in the room is over 30. But intuitively, you show up, that's not a good way of confirming the hypothesis, right? I just made it happen. I just walked in the room to make it happen. It doesn't actually affect, it doesn't say anything about the probability of the next person entering the room being over 30. Right? It's a very useless thing. Right? So these just generalizations, these statements of things that happen to be facts, they're not super explanatory, right? What you really want in science is an explanatory hypothesis. So if I said this room is hosting my 20th high school reunion, right? Then now we do have some explanatory, right, relation between the property of, right, being a 20th high school reunion and being a room full of people over 30, right? So laws should explain the world; they don't just describe it, right? And we can see this in the way that they are confirmed. You can have good confirmation, right, which is would be confirming laws that are explanatory, and you have this really trivial kind of confirmation that you, I guess, apparently could do if laws were only generalizations, but you shouldn't do because it's a bad way to confirm something. So here's just a nice quote. So it says, the fact that every f is G fails to explain why any f is G. And it fails to explain it not because its explanatory efforts are too feeble to have attracted our attention, but because the explanatory attempt is never even made. So the fact that all men are mortal does not explain why you and I are mortal. It says, in the sense of implies that we are mortal, but it doesn't even suggest why this might be so, right? So again, these generalizations, they're not even trying to explain anything. They're just saying what happens to be the case. And so you want to, if you're going to be a necessitarian of the type, right, that Dredsky endorses, and you think about laws of relationships between properties, you're going to solve all these problems, right? So the property of being a diamond is what entails its refractive index, right? Again, the property of being a diamond has a certain molecular structure. That's going to tell you what the refractive index will be. The property of where it was mined is not going to explain anything, allow you to predict anything. The property of being a 20th high school reunion is what entails and explains why the room is full of people over 30. Counterfactuals. If this rock were a diamond, right? So suppose I'm holding a piece of granite, right? I can say, well, if it were a diamond, it would have this particular refractive index. Again, universal generalizations don't help us with counterfactuals because they only describe what is the case. On this necessitarian view, as laws of as relationships between universals, doesn't turn out to be a law that all dogs born at sea are Cocker Spaniels. Again, there's no connection between the property of being born at sea and being a Cocker Spaniel. None of this depends on us and what we know, right? The properties are out there, whether right we know them or not. They exist, the relationships between them exist, and the laws are there for us to discover, right? But they're not in any way sort of like dependent on human investigation. And he does this sort of metaphor, which may be helpful for some people, right? If you're having trouble with this idea of like, what, again, how do we have a universal that's different from an object that has the property? Like, what are we talking about? So he describes universals as like a political office, right? So, you have president, governor, whatever. I think over here I have the California government. The executive branch, all the various offices, the governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, legislative branch, and so on. So different objects can fill those offices, right? So we change governors every 4 years or so. Um, but that doesn't change how those people behave in certain ways. So their behavior is constrained by the office itself, right? And there are relationships that hold between the offices regardless of who fills those offices. It's all set up in the state constitution. So he kind of wants to say universals in the laws, their relations, they're sort of like the constitution, right? The universe's constitution, and whatever object may fill those roles or instantiate those properties is not what makes the law a law, right? It's the relationships between those offices. And again, this isn't the same sort of necessity as uh, analytic necessity. So all bachelors are unmarried. This is just true in virtue of the concept of being a bachelor and being married, and it's sort of like a logical necessity based on the meanings of the terms. But laws of nature are not logically necessary in the way that 2 + 2 = 4 is logically necessary, right? Maybe that's a better example than the bachelor's unmarried. Anyways, but it's not. Remember back to Hume, right? Week one. Um, it's not like contradictory to imagine that a diamond has a different refractive index than it does. So in the way that it would probably be contradictory, I think, to think of a bachelor as being unmarried. Um, these laws are not sort of laws of logic. They're laws of nature. They could be otherwise, right? Um, but they just happen to be the way they are. Um, okay, so they're not necessary, and they're necessary in a one way, not logically necessary, but what we call nomologically necessary, right? They are um, nomological. Again, you encountered that word in the DNX model of explanation. It has to do with laws. So whatever necessity is involved is conditional on the nature of offices. If you're filling the office of being an object near the Earth, then you will necessarily accelerate towards the Earth 9.81 meters per second squared. Again, once we understand what it is to be a G and to be an F, then right, there's a law to the effect that all F's are G's. Then if you're a G, you must be an F. Right? And it allows us, though, the leeway to understand what it means to say, well, if I were an F, I would be a G, even if I'm not an F. So if I were sheriff of Los Angeles County, I would be required to enforce the laws implemented by the state legislative body. That would be the case for anyone that happened to be the sheriff, right? Um, those counterfactuals totally make sense if you think about it as relationships of offices instead of sort of the way objects happen to be. And just these universal generalizations can't capture this, right? They can only talk about what is. They can tell us what could happen. Okay, so this for Dresky is why laws explain. Laws are relationships between universals. And this is sort of a nice quote, I thought. So the period of a pendulum decreases when we shorten the length of the bob, not just because all pendulums do that, but because the period and the length are related in a particular fashion, right? Um, again, this conception of laws gives us some explanations, right? Rather than just saying, oh, that's a law because that's what things do, right? That doesn't feel explanatory. Okay, so back to what the heck? What is diamondness, right? What are you talking about, right? Aren't there just diamonds in the world? There's no extra property of diamond. I believe in that. And there's lots of talk about this in the world of metaphysics. We're not going to get into it. Um, and Dresky doesn't really get into it either. He says, look, without universals, you just don't get good laws, right? You just get these generalizations that are kind of like pretty crappy. They don't do all the things we want laws to do. And he says, don't you want laws of nature, right? They're good things. They help us do a lot. They explain the world. They help us predict. So he says, get over it, right? There are universals. Um, in the next lecture, we are going to talk about Lewis, and he's going to have an account that is a sort of regularity account that tackles just this weirdness. And he wants to say, I don't have to believe in universals in order to get all the good stuff out of laws of nature. So we will look at that one in the next lecture.